Hello and welcome everyone to our talk, CSI, Rowhammer, closing the case of half-total and beyond. I'm Andreas Kogler and with me is Jonas Juffinger. Today we're going to talk about a problem, Rowhammer, that exists since 2014.
And in this almost 10 years, numerous exploits have been built.
And overall, there are countless mitigations proposed. Currently, there are mitigations in place in your modern memory, but we show that they are ineffective.
And we think that we can build something fundamentally better, and we will show you today.
So we brought a research question with us, and we think that it would be amazing if we could transparently correct arbitrary data flips from Rowhammer attacks or general data integrity in memory if the operating system is in use. And to start off, we first will introduce the problem a bit more. So the problem we have is Rowhammer. Rowhammer acts on dynamic random access memory, or short DRAM as we know it.
DRAM is large, cheap, and energy efficient. So we want a lot of DRAM in all our devices. This is why we use DRAM. And it works the following way. It's built, every bit is stored in a cell that's built from one transistor and one capacitor.
And the keyword here is the capacitor. Capacitors lose charge over time, so we need a frequent refresh interval to reapply the charge the capacitor is storing. And there's also like another constraint for the DRAM. The DRAM is usually organized in rows. So if we speak today about the attacks or in general, we will also focus on rows. This is basically a unit of these cells in a DRAM.
Now let's talk about Rowhammer. Rowhammer is a hardware fault inside the DRAM, where frequent accesses to DRAM rows can flip bits in neighboring rows. You can see here the code on the right. It's accessing two pointers, aggressor 1 and aggressor 2. These map to the memory, as you can see it on the left, to these rows. And if we now access these aggressors a lot in this loop, after some time, bits in the victim row in between will flip.
So as we see here, that's only the code required to produce flips in your memory. So this problem gets even worse when we consider new and new generations. That has the reason because we want to increase the density of memory, because obviously your devices get smaller and smaller, but you want to have more and more storage on your device.
And this Rowhammer enables many attacks, and many countermeasures have been proposed. And we will talk about the countermeasures today.
So there's not only one variant of Rowhammer. The one we have shown you is the classic double-sided Rowhammer, where we have like one aggressor above the victim data we want to target and one aggressor below the data we target. And there's also a variant where we move one aggressor to a different position. This is this one single-sided hammering where we need only one neighbor. And then finally we have a more complex variant where we just have one aggressor. So we can already see that we have some spatial requirements from an attacker's point of view to actually mount the attack on the DRAM.
Let's talk about mitigations.
So the mitigations usually focus on some characteristics. And I will start off with the first characteristics. The assumption I have is basically that these Rowhammer flips are infrequent.
So we could just use ECC then, ECC memory, right?
Yes, that's a good keyword. We can now use error correcting codes. So you might have heard about it. We can basically build in the additional hardware redundancy to basically correct and detect a few flips. And with this, we can basically catch a low number of flips in our memory on every access we perform.
Another thing we could do, because we need these periodic refreshes to refresh the cells in our DRAM, we can just increase this refresh rate so Rowhammer is not quick enough to deplete the charges of the cell. So we simply increase the refresh rate and we won't see any flips anymore.
And also a good point here is that the attack we showed you in the beginning, where we have alternating accesses to the aggressors, and we introduce the flip in the victim, we need to perform that within one refresh interval. If our attack takes longer than a refresh interval, the data will be refreshed again in the capacitor, and we won't see any flips. So from an attacker's point of view, we have to optimize the time it takes in order to induce a flip.
And this is usually 64 milliseconds is the standard refresh interval for DRAM. The second characteristic is that attacks are detectable. Usually we can use performance monitoring counters to look at the cache behavior of our CPU, because we got a lot of cache misses if we do Rowhammer, because we always have to go to the DRAM. We don't want to any data from the CPU caches. So we see a lot of cache misses, we can detect this.
Yeah. And if we detect something like an application or a process that has so much cache misses, we can then proactively act on that and probably stop the execution of the program. The third characteristic we will focus on is, like you have seen in the patterns, we have to have this neighboring constraints. So one characteristic here is that we say these flips only manifest in the neighboring rows. And with that, we can basically classify or build a few mitigations.
The first one is guard rows. We can use every second row in our DRAM for other data. For example, there is work that uses this for integrity protected swap space. So you effectively reduce the memory of your real DRAM and have more swap space, but then you're protected because you cannot hammer the victim here. If an aggressor hammers, he will flip guard rows after some time, but the victim is protected.
Yeah. A different idea is the targeted row refresh. As we talked about, the refresh window is important, and now we can place additional refreshes on the victim if we see that the victim is getting basically hammered. So if we see here the accesses to aggressor, after some point we count the accesses, and after some threshold is reached, we will issue a refresh to the victim and prevent any data flips on the victim row.
This TRR is actually part of the LPDDR4X standard, so probably every phone you use and every smaller handheld device uses this memory that has this active Rowhammer mitigation built in.
Okay. So if we have now talked about the characteristics, so if everything would be fine, we would not give this talk. So let's start the cat and mouse game about the Rowhammer mitigations and their attacks.
Because there's some problem with Rowhammer mitigations.
So let's talk about it. So the first assumption where we say that flips are infrequent, that I can simply build ECC into it and catch Rowhammer.
That's sadly simply not true. Modern devices are so badly vulnerable to Rowhammer that there are just so many bit flips that ECC is not enough. ECC can at most detect 4 bit flips, it can only correct 1 bit flip. That's simply not enough, sadly.
What about the second characteristic, that we can detect them with performance counters? So me as an attacker, I can just monitor my system behavior and see if I have cache mates and go to memory. Can I then proactively do something?
Let's, for example, put the attack into an SGX enclave. SGX enclaves are completely protected from the other system, and there are no performance counters updated. And we actually did this in one work. So
also characteristic 2 is not that good against Rowhammer for Rowhammer countermeasures. But what's the final one? The distance 1 hammering. We have seen that all these patterns, they induce flips with a distance 1. So TRR and also the guard pages, they should be fine, right?
So that's a big problem with TRR. It's that it's a mitigation built in hardware, and it has to count the accesses to rows. And there's just not an infinite number of counters in the hardware. So if you do really complex access patterns where you do multiple attacks at the same time, you just exceed the counters, and TRR doesn't work anymore.
Okay, so similar to resource exhaustion.
Yes.
Okay, so but this sounds like an implementation problem. So if I have a limited amount of counters, I still can make a better TRR implementation and fix it. So I brought you a question, can we build the perfect TRR in order to fix that Rowhammer problem?
No, sadly not. I present to you the half-double effect.
So this effect is a bit more convoluted, so we have to start off back again. So we go back again to distance 1 hammering. So with distance 1 hammering, we have seen this attack pattern where we interchange these aggressor accesses. And we simply now measured how long it takes in amount of accesses to induce a flip into the victim row. And we can see with 20K accesses, we get the victim to flip. This takes around 1.2 milliseconds, and if you remember, that's within the refresh interval of the DRAM. However, we have an active defense against that, that's TRR. So we are protected against that.
Then we have distance 2 Rowhammer, where we hammer 1 row further out. If we do this, we see the first flip after 4 million hammers. This takes 270 milliseconds, so that's a lot longer than the standard refresh interval, so it's not possible to use distance 2 Rowhammer to hammer on commodity devices.
Yeah. And the half-double effect is now basically the combination of these two. We have a lot of we have many accesses with this distance 2 aggressors, combined with only a few of the distance 1 aggressors. And if we perform this pattern, we have a tunable parameter here that we can basically change the rate between those two. But if we perform this, we can induce a flip within 20 milliseconds of hammering. And that fits into a refresh interval. And the problem now is we have to be a bit more precise what role TR plays here.
So, yes. Let's take this example. So an attacker is hammering again, and the attacker only hammers the far aggressors here. After some time, TRR wants to protect these near aggressors because TRR thinks they are attacked by Rowhammer, and TRR does accesses to the near aggressors. And it's only really a really small amount of near aggressor accesses, but these are enough to somehow transport the Rowhammer effect to the victim row and flip a bit. So TRR, the mitigation, is actually helping us hammer. And the best thing is, or the worst thing, the more refreshes TRR does, the better it tries to protect our system, the more bit flips we see. So we turn TRR completely around.
So this means by now that we have basically in our chips, we have an active TR, which have active TR in there. The half-double effect is actually there. And also we try to find commodity devices which are affected by this effect, and we build an end-to-end exploit to demonstrate that this is actually a problem. And for that, we focused on a Chromebook device, which basically our target is these physical frame numbers, physical page frame numbers, which are located in page tables.
Yes, we defined 4 challenges that every Rowhammer exploit has to solve, and we found novel solutions for each of them. The first one is every Rowhammer exploit needs contiguous memory because we need a mapping from virtual memory to physical memory, which we usually don't know. If we have a continuous mapping, this helps a lot.
Think about the patterns where we have to place the rows at a specific order. In order to build those patterns, we need to know where the rows are located in memory.
Then we do an alternative to memory templating. The device we have here is protected by TRR and ECC. This makes Rowhammer bit flips a bit unpredictable, so we skip the templating process altogether. Then we do memory massaging to put the page tables where they should be, to put them in the victim rows, to hammer them. And then finally, we do bit flip verification, where we verify that the bit flips we introduced with Rowhammer are actually valid and do not crash our process. And we will go into detail for the 4th challenge.
The 4th one is a bit more interesting, because if we flip a bit by accident, so as a next point of view, if we flip a bit which we should not flip, we have the possibility to crash a complete system. This doesn't bring the attacker anything except for denial of service. So we need a way to verify that we can basically safely access that memory location we just hammered. And we combined this with transient execution. So basically we found that these corruptions, which the operating system detects and then shuts down the system, are not performed if we perform it transiently. So we can start a speculation window, then perform the memory access. And if the speculation window succeeds, we know that also the access without speculation will succeed, and we can access that memory location we just targeted. Yeah.
This makes our exploit really robust, and this makes it possible to exploit the device. In under 1 hour, we are able to get full read and write access to the whole physical memory of our Chromebook device. And from there, we can read and write kernel memory, induce our own code, and do whatever we want, basically.
So with this figure, we show that we can also parallelize a lot of the steps in this end-to-end exploit. And we will now focus a bit on the longest part, the C2. That's basically the hammering process. So it takes on average 23 minutes across multiple devices to get a flip. And we will now demonstrate that with
So we bought the live demo. We are SSHing into one of the Chromebook devices we have at home in Austria because someone forgot to bring them. But we hope the connection is stable. And Andreas is now starting the program that does the flipping. So here we get our physically contiguous memory to know which virtual addresses we have to access the rows in the DRAM we need to hammer. And now it's hammering.
So now we usually make the big gamble if we see a flip before we stop looking at the terminal. And
so this is a real thing. This happens by chance. There's a chance we see bit flips in the next minute. We hope so.
So also like the commodity devices.
And here's the first flip.
So, yeah. So this is a real problem, and with that, I hope I have convinced you that this is actually the case for modern devices, and we have to be a bit more specific. So we're just searching now for oval flips. So we're now hammering with this pattern we showed you, where we have like only accessing these far aggressors, since the near aggressor accesses, so these closes, are actually performed by the hardware. So an attacker only accesses those distance 2 hammers. And yeah, and also the point is that this is our most affected Chromebook. So there are multiple devices, and on average it takes 22 minutes. This one is a bit more affected by half double than other devices. Yeah, and also like we're searching for any flips. For an attack to work, we need a precise flip.
Yes, this is why we see so many bit flips now, and then real attack it will take a bit longer. But yeah, so this is a real problem. This is a bad problem. This device should be protected. It uses ECC and TRR. Can we do something better?
So by now, I hope we have convinced you that the current state of the art of mitigations with these underlying assumptions is simply not true. We have seen that some of these assumptions can easily be broken, and even the most obvious and convincing assumption that you can only induce bit flips into distance 1 is by now broken. So overall, we have all these mitigations seen in the past, and now we want to finally rethink Rowhammer mitigations.
We want to have a general approach to data integrity protection, where we don't have any assumptions on how Rowhammer works, what the characteristics of Rowhammer are, where the bit flips even come from. It can also be cosmic rays or whatever. We just protect data integrity. And we do this by using a message authentication code for all the data that we store with the data and compute and compare to detect data integrity failures.
So we have talked a lot about this ECC, so the error correcting codes, and now we make a similar approach. We replace ECC, but with something different, with the Mac, Jonas.
Yes.
So, but this is easily done, so we can easily replace, we have the space in there, we can easily swap those two out, but it comes one big problem. With a Mac, we can now suddenly detect all those bit flips by design. A cryptographic Mac is there to see changes in the data, and if the Macs don't match, the data has changed. However, Macs are not designed to correct the data again. So we have to be a bit more complex. The correction gets made complex than in error correcting code.
Yes.
Codes.
So we can only do a best effort correction. We cannot prove that we can correct any number of bit flips. But it's still enough, because if we just detect all the attacks, if we just detect every bit flip, in the worst case, we degrade all Rowhammer attacks to denial of service. So even if we cannot correct the bit flip, in the worst case, the device has to reboot, or we have to shut down some processes. But denial of service is the worst thing an attacker can do.
So that looks super theoretical. How does it look like?
Okay. I prepared a small animation here. This is the DRAM. This is where your data is stored, and this is also where Rowhammer destroys your data. And here we have the memory controller, and it has a small hardware change to compute the Mac for every data that is stored on the DRAM.
Okay, but now you use the ECC chip, right?
Yes. Then we use this Mac, and we actually use ECC memory, so we have the same memory overhead as every server or something like that. And we can even drop in replace DRAM modules. So we work with normal ECC DRAM modules. And on this additional chip of the ECC DRAM module, we store our integrity information. That's the Mac and a few parity bits.
Okay, so now we know the Mac. We know that we have the data and we have a Mac. So I assume on a read, we now compute the Mac again and check if it changed?
Exactly. On a read, we just do exactly that. If the Macs are the same, we know the data is fine. If they are not the same, we can correct a single bit flip in hardware. And this is okay for most of the use cases.
Wait. So we're just correcting one flip?
Yes.
That's not much?
That's not much. That's enough for a lot of cases where a system is not under attack. A single bit flip can happen. If a system is under attack with Rowhammer and the RAM is really bad, more bit flips can happen. And this is where we bring software in. We have a new corruption exception that's handled by a new exception handler in the operating system, everything in software. And this uses correction as a search. I will come to this in a second, to correct the data. And we have 3 new CPU instructions that this correction as a search uses.
Okay, that's a cool idea to bring software in there, because suddenly we have not only the data in the Mac, we also get the context of the data. And that's super important because the operating system knows best at which location which data is located. Think of if this page is actually located on disk, we don't even need to correct it because it's just a copy of the disk data. We can drop the corrupted data and reload it from the disk. We suddenly get a lot of new opportunities to recover data except for correcting the actual flip.
Yeah, that's really nice. There's one small problem. This operating system and the exception handler and everything, that's software, that's in the DRAM.
So if I'm now a super smart attacker, I would just target now the software with Rowhammer. So if the
You mean
software,
like this?
yes. So the software is also located in memory. So I can now induce flips in the exception handler that should handle flips.
To prevent this, we added a small secure memory to the CPU. It's only 4 pages large. That's nothing compared to all the CPU caches we have in modern CPUs. So area overhead is not a problem here. And we add our exception handler in this small secure SRAM. On a CPU die, it's not affected by Rowhammer. And we are pretty much...
So that memory is actually a different technology than the DRAM
Yes.
we want to protect.
Exactly, so there is no Rowhammer there.
Okay. Okay, that looks like an interesting concept, but now we do a Mac computation on each memory access and memory write. That must be super slow.
It's not. So we use this Mac design. We use a PMAC construction where we do compute 4 data blocks in parallel. And we use the Karma block cipher, which is developed by Qualcomm and used in almost all ARM CPUs for pointer authentication. So it's already in use in CPUs right now. And it's really low latency, so we can compute the Mac of 256-bit data in only 5.13 nanoseconds. And if we have a bigger data word, 512 bits, we can compute the Mac in 6.6 nanoseconds. Compared to the average 100 nanoseconds a DRAM access takes, that's just a small additional overhead.
Okay, I'm getting more convinced, but how does this correction in a software sense actually work? So now we have this exception and you handle that exception, right?
Yes. So we have this exception. It looks a bit like a page file handler from the outside. We get the physical address from where this bit flip happened, where the corruption is, in the CA2 register. And then we have 3 new instructions. The first one, why the physical address? That's a good question. Because we cannot trust page tables at this point. Page tables are a really good target for Rowhammer attacks.
As we've seen in the exploit. So
if we would have a virtual address, we need page tables to resolve to the physical address, and therefore we directly get the physical address. And then we have a load instruction that loads this corrupted data into a CPU register using the physical address. Then we have instruction to compute the Mac. So we are not doing the Mac computation itself in software. That would be too slow. So we do the Mac computation on hardware. And then we have instruction to write the data back into the memory if it is corrected.
okay, so there's only 3 instructions we have to add to the instruction set in order to perform the correction.
Yes.
But still, we're going back to the error correcting code case. We're now using a Mac. A Mac cannot correct bit flips.
That's true. So this is why we do only a best effort correction. The only thing we can really do is brute force search with approximate equality. So brute force search means we flip 1 bit, we compute the Mac, we compare it. We flip the next bit, we compute the Mac, we compare it, until we flip the correct bits, the Macs match, and we are happy. We know that we corrected the data. The problem is that the Macs are also in the DRAM, and if an attacker hammers the DRAM, also bits in the Mac could change. So what we allow to happen is we allow a small number of bit flips, even in the Mac, to be different. So here we see that we have the same data, but 1 bit in the Mac changed. We still say, okay, we are pretty confident that our data is correct. More on this in a second. And then we use some parity bits to shrink the search space, so we actually get a quite good performance with our brute force search.
So with the approximate equality, basically, we say that it's unlikely that the 2 Macs are similar enough, right?
Exactly. The chance that 2 Macs are similar, if the data is similar at the same time, is extremely low, and this protects us here.
Okay, we're getting there. Do you have any numbers? So how fast is software brute forcing? That sounds like a terrible idea to brute force a Mac.
It does, but it's not that bad. So here we have this graph. On the left, the bar, you can see ECC memory. This is just, it's a bar because we use the numbers for many different CPUs. ECC correction takes a different amount of time, from a few nanoseconds to up to 10 milliseconds. And then the green dot is how fast our single-bit correction in hardware is. And then the blue line is the correction in software. First, there's a huge overhead because of the exception and everything. These are just 200 microseconds. And then the overhead from the brute force search itself takes over. But you can still correct up to 5-bit flips in under a second, and 8-bit flips in an almost reasonable time of a few hours. If the data is really important, maybe a few hours is still a valid trade-off.
Okay. We also have more evaluation based on the GEM5 hardware simulator. So
we implemented CSI Rowhammer in GEM5. We implemented the Mac computation. We implemented all the CPU instructions. And then we also modified the Linux kernel to include the exception handler and do the brute force search and everything.
So there's actually like a real prototype of that simulated, because we can't build hardware.
We cannot change the CPU hardware, sadly, but there is a real prototype in software that does everything. And we evaluated the correct functionality with this. So we just simulated bit flips in GEM5, in the GEM5 memory. And it was able to detect them and to correct them. And then the system kept running even with bit flips in the kernel and everything. And we also used this to evaluate the performance overhead. For a system that's not under attack, we just added the latency for every Mac computation to every memory access to the DRAM. And we used this performance to get the performance overhead, which you can see here.
So in the graph, you see around a mean overhead of 2%, which is fine.
1%.
1%, sorry. And we have a worst case of 4% overhead. So if you think about it, it's a big impact on the performance. However, with that, we've seen we can basically fix all Rowhammer type data corruption. We can fix normal data corruption, or like the cosmic rays you mentioned from different sources.
We will just detect any number of bit flips for a worst case overhead of 4%.
Still, there's one part still missing, and that's the approximate equality. Maybe we have some crypto people in the crowd, and if you're talking about we have max and suddenly we don't care about a few bits, that sounds dangerous.
It does. So we, of course, evaluated the security of this whole approach, because doing stuff with max is always about probability, that things can go wrong, and things will go wrong after some time. It just depends on how long this time is. First, on the approximate equality. If we have, for example, 5 data bit flips, then we need P different Mac computations to check all the possibilities for which we can have for 5 data bit flips. So during the brute force search, we have to flip 5 bits, and all the different possibilities are P. And then we take log 2 of P. At the same time, we allow the 3 bits in the Mac to be different.
So that's the approximate equality.
That's the approximate equality. 3 bits can be different. This decreases the strength of our Mac from 56 bits, that's our Mac length, to only 41.2 bits. So by only allowing 3 bits to be different, this decreases the Mac strength by a lot. But the 41.2 is still a lot larger than 26, and therefore this is still secure. So the chance of finding a second pre-image instead of the real correction is still really low. And the further we go up with data bit flips we search, we have to go down with the number of bit flips that are different in the Mac. So if you have 8 data bit flips, we cannot allow any bits in the Mac to be different. Otherwise, the chance of finding a second pre-image instead of the real data would be quite high. We also looked at the silent data corruption rate for a system that's not under attack. So we took data from different works that looked at bit flips happening in huge server farms and how often this happens. And we computed that if we use this natural data of bit flips happening, the chance that the silent data corruption happens, which means that one bit flip changes the data in a way that it is actually a second pre-image of the original data and the max are the same, happens once per 10 to the power of 9 billion years. So that's quite secure.
Will take some time, yes.
Yes. And if a system is under attack with Rowhammer, and this Rowhammer attacker is really fortunate, the attacker is able to flip bits every 128 milliseconds for a full year. So this is way, way worse than the Chromebook you just saw. It's like 10 flips per second for a full year straight. then the attacker has a chance to find a second pre-image with the chance of 10 to the power of minus 4%, so still really low. And also this attacker is not really realistic, that has so many bit flips.
So let's go back to the Chromebook case again. So basically what we saw, if we do that for 1 year, straight through, we would have seen, I don't know, millions of flips on a Chromebook?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so we mentioned that we have software in the big advantage of this approach is the software. But we also wanted to take a look on how easy would such an approach be to apply on a wider scale. And if you think about it, it's a software hardware co-design. So we have software changes, which are usually easy to deploy, and also we have hardware changes, which take some time to get adapted to. But if you now think about like virtualized environments, like server farms, like AWS or something like that, we can basically use a virtualized environment in order to transparently protect our guests now against data corruption. Basically, we just perform the approach we just talked about on a host system, and if a guest accesses data and the corruption exception is raised, we just catch it in the host system. The host then transparently corrects, brute force searches the correct value, and then restarts the guest after the correction is after the corruption is fixed.
So we have guest support is only optional, we don't need it. If a guest would support CSI Rowhammer, then it could also do advanced correction mechanisms like reloading data from disk and stuff like that. But this makes upgrading relatively easy. So if the hardware changes are there, then a server farm could easily upgrade all the systems to CSI Rowhammer by just upgrading the hosts, and the virtual machines can run as is, which is quite neat.
So let's talk about a few possibilities we have. So we have seen that we have now basically the problem to find a correct value for a given MAC. And we can simply think about it, get a bit crazy. So we could offer basically like data corruption correction as a service. So you give me your corrupted data and I give you back the original data that matches the MAC.
Sounds reasonable. We could also do something like correction by ChatGPT. Software opens up so many possibilities. So you can just ask ChatGPT, find the error in test message, you probably already found it, so that it has the following hash. This should be the hash of the correct message. And ChatGPT answers the following. This is not really possible because a hash function is a one-way function, therefore it's not possible, blah, blah, blah.
I mean, that sounds quite reasonable, but
yeah, so I asked it if it can brute force the answer for me, and that's sadly not possible. So I mean, maybe we need a new version of this.
You forgot the U, maybe that's the problem. So, no, back to topic. So if you really think about it, if we have like a server farm with big scale, we could, for example, deploy an FGBA, so an accelerator, that's dedicated for the specific task of finding the correct value for the corruption. And we could put like 500,000 karma blocks on the device and largely scale up the performance of this correction finding. So it would no longer take 5 hours on a standard CPU, but only 40 seconds for an 8-bit data flip in a single data word. And if you go back again to the Chromebook case, there we see not so many flips in a data word. We see a lot of flips, but not like many in the same data word. Yeah. So there we already gain a lot.
You're thinking now, okay, we are going from a hardware detection to software and now back to hardware acceleration. That doesn't really make sense. But it does because we don't need this hardware acceleration in every computer in a server farm, for example. If a server farm has only a few correction nodes, this is enough because 8-bit flips don't happen all the time. They happen maybe for one system that's under attack or for another system once per year. So we just have a huge server farm. We have one data correction node that has some hardware accelerated correctors. Specialized data correction nodes, exactly. This is all stuff that's possible because we can do things in software.
Yeah. And also, if we go back to the examples we mentioned, now we have finally like the context for the data stored in memory. And with that, and the kernel and the operating system probably knows best, we can now basically protect things where we know where to reconstruct the data from. So think of kernel code. If we know that we have a flip on that position in the kernel, we know probably the function which it belongs to. And usually kernels don't do cheat code or something like that, so we can simply reload the code from somewhere else. We know that code. Also for page tables, the one thing we targeted in the exploits, we can now use the operating system's representation of page tables to reconstruct the page tables simply after we've seen that there's a flip.
or other structures, like for example the task struct. There are many values in there. We know which ranges these values can have. We know which are valid values. So when we do a brute force search for structs where we know the data or how the data should look like, we can extremely improve the brute force search, because it's not a brute force search over the whole data, but only values that are valid for this task struct. Let's say user ID can be at most 65,000.
Yes.
And then we know we only have to search this range if we know there is a bit flip.
Also, there might be data structures where flips are irrelevant. If you have a flip in a JPEG, for example, or PNG, or for JPEG not, for PNG, you might not even care about it. So if you know context to the data you're actually protecting, it makes much things more flexible in the same sense. Yeah. And the biggest example we could have is think of a page. If you have like 4 kilobytes of memory, and we know that we can reload the data from the disk, we can basically correct 32K bit flips in the worst case, or in the best case, with a single reload of a page. That's way more than the 8 flips we can correct as a search, because now we have the context. We know how to get the data back. And also, like, there are a lot of optimizations we could use if we imagine that, also like this Rowhammer mitigation or this data corruption mitigation in general, to beyond that scope we're currently presenting.
Because the main performance impact of CSI Rowhammer is caused by doing the MAC computation on every memory read and every memory write. We always have to compute the MAC. But the MAC will be true 99.999% of the time. The MAC will be correct and the data will be fine. So we could simply transiently execute with unverified data while the MAC is checked. We already do transient execution.
But there's a whole track about transient execution attacks and how they go wrong. Are you sure you want to do that?
I'll just say it really shortly here. There is work that tells us that this can be made secure. We didn't evaluate it fully, but we say it is possible to do this. And then we would have CSI Rowhammer with no performance impact.
That sounds great. So with that, we already come to the conclusion. And I hope we have convinced you that mitigations for Rowhammer with assumptions on characteristics of Rowhammer can go wrong. They are going wrong. We have basically, we ran through the list. And if we bring software to the error correction in process, we have so much more flexibility to do things. We can do the brute force approach to try to find the correct data to the MAC. We can reload the data from disk or, I don't know, from a network packet.
Outsource data correction. Yes, we can do so many things. If you're interested in this stuff, all our code is open source. So the exploit is the half double. You can look at the exploit code. And all the hardware simulation and the modified Linux kernel and everything for CSI Rowhammer, it's open source and you can run it yourself and experiment with it.
And also for the exploit code, there's also like we heard in the keynote, it's more like how to find if you're affected. We also have like tools to find out if you're affected or not.
Yes, that you can simply run. Yeah. If you're interested in more details, read our papers. There's a lot more stuff going on that's interesting. And with this, thank you very much. And we have 2 minutes for questions. So if someone has a question, there's a microphone in the middle.
Actually, we have 7. 7. This was 2:40.
What? No, we
have 7 minutes for questions.
Oh, we have 7 minutes. Great. So if there are any...
So thank you.